So this is a part of our ongoing efforts to shift some of our spiritual formation and adult education materials at Old Cambridge Baptist Church to a virtual format. Some of those will be a short video like this that folks can watch and then hopefully interact with one another either on a Zoom call that we might set up to talk about the material or in a kind of blog format that we can contribute to on an ongoing basis. So let me talk about the context of this conversation first. During Lent, we're focusing our liturgical and educational materials on the theme of grief, mourning, and lament. Part of what we had started in that regard was a series of Thursday night discussions on particular aspects of grief and mourning and loss and death that we don't normally get to bring into conversation. So these were things that began with a conversation with Kevin Hinsey on suicide and grief after suicide. We were kind of postponing a conversation with Tammy and Pat McLeod about ambiguous loss. There'll be a recording like this one of Jenny Stewart talking about traumatic forms of grief and grieving. And then this is a conversation about narrative resources for grief and grieving. And the reason this sort of fits in with that category of things we don't normally get invited to talk about is that narrative therapeutic theory has a slightly different understanding of what we're doing when we enter into a process of grieving the loss of someone who has died, and has a different perspective on the resources that we might draw upon for those kinds of that kind of grief work. So I've invited Holly White to come and just engage in conversation together so that this is not a monologue of me explaining this kind of thing. She can help me think better in conversation, and we can kind of have a conversation for you and then invite you into the conversation in some virtual fashions later. So welcome, Dr. White. Glad you're here. Glad that you're willing to converse with me about narrative grief and grieving. Would it be helpful for you to say a few words first about narrative therapeutic theory, or do you have something that you would like to start out with?
No, I think that would be helpful. You just had some.
Yeah. So just a brief, very brief rundown of narrative therapeutic theory. This is the theory that I was most trained in my training, particularly my doctoral training in pastoral care and counseling. And narrative therapy is considered a postmodern form of therapy. So it questions a lot of the assumptions of therapeutic theory, from psychoanalytic theory up to cognitive behavioral therapy and a lot of the popular forms of therapy that are around today. It is rooted in the work of Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault is very famous for sort of uncovering the attachments to relations of power that various forms of knowledge have, particularly psychiatric and medical forms of knowledge. So narrative therapy is really rooted in that work of Michel Foucault and a guy named Michael White and another guy named David Epson from Australia began developing a psychotherapeutic theory out of that Foucauldian post-structuralist, postmodern philosophy. And then they were very interested also in Aboriginal people in Australia and the ways that many modern forms of therapy were not particularly attentive to their lived experience and their experiences of injustice and the particular indigenous knowledges that they brought to perspectives on healing and things of that nature. So that informed White and Epson. And what we're going to talk about today in particular is rooted in an article of Michael White's called Saying Hello Again. And one thing that you really need to understand about narrative theory to get why White's perspective is so important to the narrative frame is that narrative theorists, and this is where the narrative part comes in, don't see us as having an essential, fixed, static sense of self. But that our sense of who we are as people, our sense of identity, our sense of self is socially constructed through language, through the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories we tell about one another and the stories that get told about us and the stories that circulate around us in the larger cultural and religious and psychiatric and legal discourses. So we have all of this available narrative material that we are constantly immersed in, and that material is what we use to sort of construct, like building blocks out of narratives, construct our sense of who we are as people, as human beings, and construct our knowledge of the world in which we live. So that's a basic rundown of narrative therapy. There's a really great website of the Dolit Center. If you want to watch a few videos on just a little bit more about narrative therapy and what narrative therapists are up to, that's a great resource. I can try to post that URL later. What does that sound like to you?
Actually, that's interesting. What it sounds like to me as I'm thinking about narrative, that we often think of stories as having a beginning, middle, and an end. And so we tell stories to one another about our childhood as a sort of beginning, and like we knew from a very young age that you were always going to be a train conductor because you loved playing the trains. Is that the sort of thing that you're thinking of, or about the way that sort of we tell stories about ourselves, but then maybe have to re-narrate ourselves when we grow up and we realize that train transportation doesn't exist in the same way, and so we have to sort of reimagine our lives or our careers in those ways?
Yeah, that's a really nice example of stories that get told about us that sort of inform our sense of what we should be doing in the world. And narrative therapists are particularly interested in what stories work for us, and then the points at which the stories stop working and actually become debilitating narratives. So the narrative therapists often talk about dominant narratives, dominant discourses that we are drawing on to tell us who we are, and some of those may be very harmful. Like maybe I have grown up receiving the message in a lot of different ways that I'm a stupid person. So that becomes a dominant narrative in my life that informs my sense of who I am as a human being. Everything that I do, I'm seeing in the light of that narrative of being a stupid person. And narrative therapists, in the course of the therapeutic work, what they're interested in doing is helping a person notice exceptions to that dominant narrative. Like in the course of talking about your life, there may be a certain story that comes up that you're talking with your therapist about a time when you figured something out that your coworkers couldn't figure out. And you just sort of bypass that because that doesn't go with the dominant narrative of being a stupid person. But a good narrative therapist will say, wait just a second, now that is an interesting story. Say more about that particular story, and renders that narrative that is subjugated, it's a subjugated narrative under the dominant narrative of being a stupid person, significant. It says that is something we should hear more about. Like, who else knew that about you when you figured out this problem at work that none of your coworkers could figure out? And what did you think that said about you when you figured this thing out? And so this one sparkling moment of a subjugated narrative that's sort of come to the surface then can be drawn out even more and attached to other particular instances and stories and narratives that makes the dominant narrative of me being a stupid person a little less dominant in my life, and raises this narrative of me sometimes actually being quite resourceful, or having a lot of ingenuity, or being able to figure things out that really need to be figured out, being a problem solver. Like those kinds of narratives then are filled out or thickened and made more significant. That's just a sort of brief synopsis. And narrative therapists have a lot of really great tools, and the best tool, the most critical tool, narrative therapy. I'm trying to think about which narrative therapist uses this particular phrase. Well, it doesn't matter right now. But narrative therapy is the art of asking beautiful questions. So the question is the most significant tool of narrative work. And you'll see that when we get to this grief and grieving stuff Michael White talks about in Saying Hello Again.
So the beautiful question is the one that has maybe some timing to it, maybe has some, I mean, I'm just guessing here, so help me understand what would make a beautiful question, or, well, two things come to mind as you're talking. You know, there's the thing about the question, but it sounds like there's a skill, or you know, the therapist has a lot of intention, good intention for the person that they're talking to, and a particular sort of quality of listening that is maybe not familiar to many people.
Yeah, it isn't familiar because it's not encouraged. It's a form of listening that isn't listening for the deficit. It is listening to the exception to the deficit narrative. And I mean, just as an example, I keep this little notebook. I've kept this ever since I was intern in my doctoral program doing narrative therapy. And the notebook is really just full of questions and perspectives to help the therapist kind of orient the therapist itself in relation to the stories they're hearing. But mostly it's just a lot of beautiful questions that I've discovered in various places, in writing, in conversations, in narrative therapy books that I've written down. I want to keep so that I can keep reading these over and retrain myself to ask these kinds of questions about people, about life, rather than the questions that we are typically invited to ask, which are ones about pathology and deficit and problems and things of that nature. And don't get me wrong, the problem is important, but narrative therapists very clearly say the problem is the problem. The person is not the problem. And even more nuanced is the person's relationship to the problem that is the problem. And so narrative therapists engage in this thing that they call externalizing, where through our work with a client, we separate the client's sense of who they are as a person from the problem, so that the problem can be held out and examined and not have the power of telling that person who they are, and totalizing, pathologizing sense, which really comes into play when we talk about grief and grieving in a narrative way.
Right. Well, because it's easy to pathologize a person as just a bundle of sad, or like, we think of ourselves as the person who has lost something. We orient ourselves towards the thing that is missing. I am a widow. I'm without child. Or the thing, I don't have a job. Like, I'm jobless. I'm homeless. Like we identify with these sort of losses as opposed to other things about ourselves.
Yeah, and it might not be that those things aren't important to you, but that may not be the most important things for you to be recognizing about yourself. But the narrative of that death or that loss or the deficit that is in your life can become debilitating. And our typical grief and grieving theories have suggested a particular movement in relation to that loss to us. Most people are familiar with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of death and dying, which are really about the dying process. Kubler-Ross was interested in how dying people were experiencing that death. But it's been reframed to also talk about grief in terms of these 5 discrete stages that we presume in our minds, even though Kubler-Ross didn't quite have this in mind, but that we've come to presume move in a linear fashion from denial to anger to depression to acceptance. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And that acceptance piece is the part where we have a sense of closure, at least in our colloquial sense of what those stages mean. Another grief theorist makes this really plain in his stages, and most of these models are stage models. They at least suggest a linear process through grief and grieving. And there's a guy named William Worden who wrote a lot about stages of grief and grieving, and he talked about it in terms of accepting the reality of the loss, experiencing the pain of grief, adjusting to a world in which the deceased person is missing, and then, here's the critical part, withdrawing our emotional energy from that deceased person and replacing that or placing that emotional relational energy into other relationships. which is that part about acceptance that we kind of get hammered with when we're in the grief process. Both these dominant narratives about grief and grieving in the psychiatric and psychological and psychotherapeutic literature, but also our everyday conversations. We're often pushed toward acceptance and closure. I mean, you think about the things people even say to you at a funeral sometimes, and with the best of intentions, like, he's in a better place. But you've heard this in the hospital, even. I mean, when the death is so fresh that the person is still there, but he's in a better place. At least he's not suffering anymore. And all those things might make some theological sense to the people in the room, but it is a movement toward closure, whereas the narrative model of grief and grieving says there is something else that can take place too.
Well, certainly, like just past tense versus present tense language around death. Like, we have this very clear moment. He is, he was.
Yeah.
And so the narrative would, like, that forecloses the narrative. If, like, the life has ended, the story is over, and yet the story continues on in the life of the people who knew the person, because the story the story of the person's life is extended through the memory and the activities of those people that the person who passed affected.
Exactly, yeah. And that's what narrative therapists really want to help people to do in the process of grief. And it's not, Michael White's clear about this in that article that I mentioned, Saying Hello Again. It's not that there aren't some things we do have to say goodbye to. We might have to say goodbye to some hopes and dreams we had for this relationship, and things we wanted to experience with that person, trips we wanted to take with that person, growing old with this person, and all these sorts of things that are really clearly things that we have to say goodbye to because they're not going to happen anymore. But what narrative therapists are really interested, what narrative theory is really interested in, are the things that we shouldn't have to say goodbye to, and we don't need to say goodbye to, because saying goodbye to them makes it almost feel like we're saying goodbye to a part of ourself. Because we are created, our sense of self is constructed in relationship. So when we bury that person who is beloved to us and to whom we were beloved, we don't want to bury important parts of ourself with that person. So for example, the memories that we shared together that only that person knew, things that only that person knew about us. Really importantly, and we don't talk about this very much at all, is the way that we came to see ourselves through their eyes. So, like, how did they see us in ways that we really appreciated being seen? We don't want to say goodbye to those things because they're about our identity, our sense of self, our sense of who we are in relationship. And that's what narrative theorists are interested in helping people say hello to again after death.
So saying hello. So how does one then go about, you keep using examples of theorists and therapists who are working. So if a person doesn't have access to those people, maybe you could say a little bit more about these beautiful questions, or what is it that how would I, watching a 30-minute video, sort of get it in contact with this power of saying hello in narrative therapy?
Yeah. The great thing about narrative therapy is that it's very critical of expertise, and it really wants the theory to be accessible to everyone. That it's really a way of living and not just a way of doing therapy. And one of the resources I want to share a little later is from a book that a narrative theorist, I remember now, Stephen Madigan is the person who calls narrative therapy the art of asking beautiful questions. But this is not Stephen Madigan. This is another book by a man named David Denborough called Retelling the Stories of Our Lives, published by Norton in 2014. And Denborough is really, in that book, basically trying to create a self-help book with narrative theory. So it is, as much as any therapeutic theory I've ever encountered, a kind of democratized theory. It is intended for everyone to be able to use in their everyday life. And narrative therapists are really clear about this, that in the therapeutic relationship, the client is the expert in the room. Because the subject of that relationship is the client's life, and the therapist is not the expert of the client's life. That is not the orientation of most therapeutic theories, you see. Most therapeutic theories, the therapist is the expert because the therapist has the expert knowledge of the theory that is being applied to this work. Of course, there are other people practicing other therapeutic theories who also have embraced that notion of the client being the expert in their life too. But that is cornerstone to narrative theory. So you can access this in a lot of ways. There are places like Dole Center that are trying to help get people narrative resources to help them orient themselves toward these kinds of questions and ways of listening and ways of understanding ourselves. There are books like Retelling the Story of Our Lives. But I can just give you some examples of how we might do this with grief work. So I thought about this the other day as I was thinking about this video. A few weeks ago, I went back to South Carolina to see my family and see one grandfather who was in the hospital. And as I was leaving, I was talking to my grandmother about my drive back because I was driving from South Carolina to Massachusetts, and she was talking about a road trip that she had taken with my other grandfather who died about 5 years ago, and they took a lot of road trips all around the United States. And they talked about, and she talked about how, you know, if you saw something on a sign on the side of the road, all you had to say was, "I would like to see that," and he would pull over and he would go see that thing. Like, he had no real sense of urgency about trips. If you didn't get where you were going to go, that might be okay because you're going to see other things along the way. That is not typically how I live my life. I like, you know, to know what I'm doing and to have agendas and schedules and things like that. But one of the things that I recognized in that story was that there is that element of my grandfather's life and his way of being in the world that I think he would want me to inherit. You know, it's a virtue or a value. It's not a material thing, but it's something that was important about how he lived his life. And so on the drive back, you know, I saw this sign for the Natural Bridge State Park in Virginia, which is this naturally carved bridge that's been carved over millions of years by this river, and it's a really spectacular place. And I even remember my grandmother saying that she had seen that one time with my grandfather, and I thought, well, you know, to really inherit this value that I appreciated about my grandfather, who's now dead, I'm going to take a couple of hours out of my hurried trip home because I was ready to get back and stop and see this place. Think about my grandmother and grandfather having been here at one point, to embody this value that he embodied of taking your time, seeing things you wanted to see, not being hurried to get to the destination. So that in some way is an example of how I, in that moment, in that decision, was saying hello again to my grandfather. Because it was not something that I would normally have done, but in reflecting on that relationship and what I valued about that relationship and what he helped me to experience in life, I had this great experience of saying hello again to my grandfather in this, you know, in this short stop on the side of the road in Virginia to see this natural, spectacular sight.
I like that, and a phrase that you stuck out at me in what you're saying, what he would want me to inherit.
Mm-hmm.
A sense of, you know, versus what you'd admired about him.
Yeah.
There are things that we perceive that other people live for their intention into the world. Do you understand that difference, or how would you understand that difference?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good description, because it's not something I necessarily always appreciated when I was growing up. You know, my parents made fun of me all my life about, you know, my question when we would go on vacation is, what are we going to do next? And that's how I live. That's kind of how I live my life if I'm not careful. Is what are we going to do next? And so I definitely don't think I appreciate that about him or admired that in him necessarily growing up. But if I reflect on, what legacy he would leave me in terms of values and virtues, it would be something like that. And his willingness to go out of his way to help other people, even at his own expense sometimes, some things that this thing from David Denborough that I'm going to make available to folks to do, and I really hope that folks will do this at home. It's called a will and testament of legacies and learnings and virtue. And I imagine if he had answered some of these questions, something like that, slowing down and experiencing life or something, would probably be something he listed. Here's a good question that we can think about in terms of our own life. I acknowledge that the following virtues and values were passed down to me, either from people I met in the course of my life, or from people I did not meet personally but heard about, read about, or listened to, and who were significant to me. And this can include pets. This can include invisible friends. But the values and virtues passed down to me. And then I acknowledge that I've learned the following things during the course of this lifetime, including learnings that came from difficult times. And you sort of write some of those things here. And I propose the following virtues, values, and learnings that were passed down from me to be distributed to the following people and pets who could make the most use of them. So, you might write down a willingness to slow down and experience life and not worry too much about getting to the destination. And I inherited that from my grandfather. And I want to pass that along to someone significant in my life, my nephew or my, something like that. So it's being really intentional about it, and this is a way of working through your own mortality in some ways, not just about grieving others' losses, but thinking really carefully and beautifully about how we inherited our values and virtues and what we hope will live on in other people after we're gone. And importantly, because I don't want you to think narrative theory is very Pollyanna-ish, I direct the following characteristics not to be passed on to any of my dear ones, and that they should end with me. So, it's very clear, you don't want to pass everything on. There are some things you wish would just die with you, like my temper, or my hurry, or my whatever, So this is a resource for working through our own reality of death and dying and mortality in a narrative fashion. Yeah.
Can I follow up with that? Because I think one thing that catches, that is a totem object that I would really love access to, but we're just going to hold off on that. I can see how we have ambivalent relationships to our inheritances and the relationships of people that pass. We may really, I don't know that we have anything like unalloyed love for every single person. And certainly those people in our families or, who precede us in death, there might be things about them that, you kind of roll your little eyes at. You're like, okay, I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if that's the inheritance I want to take. And so, can you say a little bit about how we orient ourselves sort of positively, too strong a word, but sort of lightly, without burden towards these inheritances or in our mourning? It seems like there's a secret there in what you're saying about how these sorts of, this mode of narrative in encountering loss, in grief, and our grieving, it gives us opportunities and things like that carrying forward, but we don't want to feel burdened with those things carrying forward, because that's not what the point of this is, I'm getting. So can you say a little bit about how we would distinguish those two things?
never really thought about it in quite those terms. I mean, I think that the point of this, saying hello again to things that we value about that person and the way they saw us and things like that, is to hold on to the things that are important about ourselves, the things that we appreciate about ourselves and about our sense of who we are in relation to others, in relation to that person, in relation to other people. So, there may very well be things about how another person saw you and the relationship you have with another person that you do want to let go of. I mean, it's not going to be the case that those things don't continue to influence you and affect you, but those aren't the narratives that you want to thicken through this appreciative process.
Right, so I can actually just apply this to what I just did. So as I'm talking, I'm like, oh, listen to me. I have a real sense of seriousness and concern, like about how things are done. I could sometimes get very worried. And some people would, maybe someone would say, well, you're awfully worried about things, Holly, getting it right and all. But like another reframing or another narrative of that is like, you take things really seriously because you care about other people and yourself, and you want things to go well because you believe that when you care and things go well, that great and better things can happen. Is that an example?
Yeah, I think it's a good example of a particular narrative, sometimes operating in a way that's not helpful, and other times operating in a way that's really helpful. And being able to see how that narrative plays out in different ways in different circumstances, and being able to make more choices in relation to how that narrative works in your life, to be more cognizant of what's happening so narrative, remember, talks about things in an externalizing manner. So you use the term worry. So a narrative therapist might say, is worry the name you would want to apply to that? Is that the best description of what you're concerned about here? So just say yes. We'll go with that.
Yes.
For the sake of time, and since we're not doing therapy. So if you said that yes, worry is a really good description of what I'm dealing with, then a narrative therapist is going to talk about that in an externalized way by saying something like, when is it in the course of your day that you first notice worry knocking on the door? Or other ways of doing it, something like, when worry is most present with you, how do you feel worry showing up in your life? Does it feel like carrying around a backpack full of rocks? Does it feel like bees swarming around your head? That kind of thing. Like really externalizing worry, so that linguistically and narratively, we don't think about worry as being a part of who we are, but a problem that we are relating to and can relate to differently.
Those are good questions. Do you have other questions from your secret book?
Oh, I have so many questions in my secret book. I'll give you some questions from Michael White about that he has used with clients about death. So I'll just read a few of them because I think they're all beautiful. And let's just make up a name of a person who's died. Bill, let's just say. If you were seeing yourself through Bill's eyes right now, what would you be noticing about yourself that you could appreciate? See how different that is than asking, what do you appreciate about yourself? It's asking you to think about this in a relational way. That's something that that Bill sees in you and that you appreciate having seen in you. What difference would it make to how you feel if you were appreciating this in yourself right now? What do you know about yourself that you are awakened to when you bring alive the enjoyable things that Bill knew about you? What difference would it make to you if you kept this realization about yourself alive on a day-to-day basis? That what difference question is a really important one for narrativists. Some more that Michael White has here. How could you let others know that you have reclaimed some of the discoveries about yourself that were clearly visible to Bill and that you personally find attractive? So how can you let other people know that you've reclaimed these values that Bill saw in you? That's building this cadre of witnesses who are seeing you do this reconstructive work. In taking this next step, what else would you think you might find about yourself that could be important for you to know? What did Bill see when he looked at you through his eyes? How did he know these things about you? It's inviting people to tell a story about that, not just list values, but how did Bill know that you had the ability to make people laugh? And then that's an invitation to stories about how that particular thing that Bill knew about you, that you appreciate about yourself, came to knowledge. What is it about you that told him about this? What can you now see in yourself that had been lost to you? What difference would it make to your relationships with others if you carried this knowledge with you in your daily life? What could you do to introduce others to this new picture of yourself as a person? So that's just some examples of the beautiful questions that narrative theorists are inviting us to ask about ourselves and about our relationship with the ones that we love who have died, that are still a part of us, that will never not be a part of us, because our sense of who we are was constructed in relationship with that person. So that's the saying hello again.
So the saying hello is sort of being this sort of person sort of mirrors something about ourselves that we value or maybe had forgotten or are afraid of losing. And sort of can live into, and we should practice into, like demonstrate, or so it reinforces the relationship that we have with the person who has passed.
Yeah, it even invites other people into that knowledge to witness those things about us that this person knew that we appreciate, and sort of builds a cadre of other people who are going to start maybe seeing that about us and helping us live into that anew.
So in your case of like roadside attractions and your grandfather, and is that something that, how do we engage other people? Like, should we be telling people about, hey, this is something I'm doing because, my Nana would really be proud of me if I was doing this?
I don't know. I think that's up to you. For me, it wasn't something I felt like I needed to tell, although now here, I've shared it with everybody who's watching the video, but it wasn't something I felt like I needed to tell so much as it was something I just needed to recognize and live into in that moment and in other moments, with the knowledge that part of that relationship with my grandfather was being invoked in that moment. That it was something about his legacy to me that allowed me to have that experience.
How do you imagine going forward how that experience of doing something out of your norm, how might that go in other ways, do you think?
I don't know. That's a good question. I hope to continue to be attentive to that. As I take my drives across the country and things like that. But it has sort of. I hadn't thought about this before, but it's sort of shaped in some ways the way I'm thinking about my sabbatical for 2021, and thinking about this invitation taking this invitation to slow down and claim some experience that will bring me joy. And hopefully, pending all of this COVID-19 stuff going away by 2021, we will be able to go to Ecuador and experience this brand new place that I don't have any real developed research interests that I'm trying to pursue there. I'm trying to have an experience of something vastly different from what I've experienced before, that will be a joyful experience, and an experience of slowing down and seeing the world. And those are some of the stories I appreciate most from my memories of my grandfather. It's him talking about, he was in the Marine Corps, and I don't know, I hardly know anything that he actually did as a Marine, but I know tons of stories about things that he saw, places that he went. I mean, for him, it was like this experience of seeing the world. For someone who at that time in his life had probably never really been much out of South Carolina or the South at least. And then later in life, hearing stories of going on a mission trip to Belize and going on a mission trip to Wyoming and building a church, and on my drive from California to Boston. And again, right before I got in the car to leave, had a conversation with my grandmother who said, I wonder if you're going to pass that little town in Wyoming where we went and built that church. And I heard stories about this all my life, so I thought, on the drive, I'm just going to stop and see this church that my grandparents and father and other church people built. And so I did. It was this tiny little place off the side of the interstate. Probably couldn't have been more than a few hundred people that live in this little town. And pulled up to the church, and a woman comes out of the house next door and asks how we're doing. I said, fine. My grandfather helped build this church way back. And she said, oh, well, I'm the pastor's wife. He's out of town right now. Why don't you go on in there and take a look? And so,
new friends.
Doing things like that, I think, are important ways of keeping that relationship alive, even after the person has died.
So I have one follow-up, one more question here. I don't know how much more time we want to take, but a couple of things come to mind is, obviously these are things that we can, with these tools, we can start to work on these things ourselves, worksheets and whatnot. But, like you said at the start, he's in a better place. Things that we say to one another to comfort one another in grief, but are pretty cold comfort. So, can you say a little bit about maybe some of those beautiful questions that maybe simply stated, or things that sort of give us access to these parts of ourselves by means of our relationships with living others?
Yeah. I think a lot of times people are really hesitant to ask a friend about a dead loved one because they don't want to, bring up the loss, or send that person back into their grief or something like that, as if this person has just moved on to closure at that point. And so that's the first hurdle to get over, I think, is just feeling like you can talk about someone who has died and not disrupt this presumed closure, because that's sort of a myth anyway. Mm-hmm. But, asking questions like that, I think, are really nice questions. They're not the kinds of questions you necessarily want to ask at a funeral home. In that moment, that's a time for sort of solicitous care and words of comfort that involve more your being with that person. I am so sorry for this loss, and I know this is going to be a really hard time for you, and I'm here with you and for you, that kind of stuff. But in the weeks and months and years following, those are the times when we can ask each other questions like, what is it about that? What is it about the relationship with your loved one that you miss most? And what does that mean to you? Mm-hmm. That thing that you miss. What is it that you are no longer experiencing about yourself because that person isn't here to remind you about it? And then when you find out what that is, how can I help you remember that part about yourself? Or how are you reminded about that thing about yourself that you appreciate in your day-to-day life that you might not have noticed? Just getting beyond the questions about how are you doing and are you feeling better, and those kinds of things. We can actually ask creative.
You got this.
Yeah. That's the thing I really appreciate about narrative therapists, is that they have a very extreme confidence in the ability of every person to do this work among ourselves. At times, we need a therapist to help us do some of this work. But in most times in our life, we don't need a therapist to help us do this work. We help one another do this work. And I think all these tools that I've iterated today are things that we can all practice in our relationships. They're not expert knowledge that only the trained professional can bring to bear a relationship. It's
But I read the article, the Michael White article that you started, and one thing that really stuck with me was just sort of maybe how this information might be hard to access in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the confidence, telling one another confidently how capable they are may feel like a contradiction from what they feel. If they are in active grief still, like they don't have, they're maybe uncertain about how to access that. I just am thinking about that as a sort of like recognition that like we do want to believe in other people for the resources that we do believe that the people will have the resources in them, that they do have them, but they may not have know how to access them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I'm interested in, sort of how, I think reading, and I think a questionnaire will be important, but I think also sort of being in relationship with others so that we can help one another access those things. And that's why I liked getting those concrete questions that we can help each other.
That's really helpful. So if I could just boil it down to just a few tips that will help move people into this form of relationship. I'm doing this just sort of off the cuff here. So I would say, firstly, when you're tempted to give advice or make declarative statements about something, invite yourself to instead ask a question. Because questions are the tools that we use to get into this kind of relationality. And those questions should be two things. One, very open-ended questions that invite exploration and invite a story. So get, practice in your own, mind, just developing questions that invite stories from people. Mm. So open-ended, story-inviting questions. And secondly, and this is really important and really hard, don't ask questions that you already know the answers to. Because we do that all the time in conversation. We ask a question for someone else to tell us what we already think we know. But that's not what this kind of thing is. This is a very subversive way almost of forming questions that presumes that we are asking this question out of a genuine sense of curiosity and willingness to explore and willingness to get into the unknown with people. So ask questions. Make sure they are curious questions, not questions you already know the answer to, questions that have an open-endedness and an invitation to story about them. And then, if you get stuck in conversation, narrative therapists will say it's never the client's fault that the therapeutic relationship gets stuck or that people are making progress in therapy. It's always the therapist's concern. And it's not because they aren't doing their job well, it's because they haven't arrived at the right question yet. So just keep asking better and more beautiful questions. And that is sort of the invitation into this type of relationality. Not only relationship with one another, but a different kind of relationship with ourselves. Questions. That's really the crux of the whole thing, I think. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It was a lot of fun.
It was. Thank you. And I'll be looking for photocopy pages of that photocopic of
yes.
your notebook.
And you can have this one.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, this is to appease me. Guys,
I'm going to go bury this back in my... and we will invite questions and comments and conversation from everyone who is viewing this in some format in the coming days after, or maybe even simultaneous to this video being shared. And look for other things like this in the near future as we are socially distancing or physically distancing ourselves from one another and washing our hands off. So take care, and we will see you soon.